being active costs energy. Like, this isn't free. And so if the idea is to restore energy supplies and you're using energy, why would that work? And it's purely, I think the whole active recovery thing has really to do with lactate.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. Today I'll be chatting with sports scientist Andri Feldmann. Andri is the co-developer of the Moxy Monitor and is currently working on his doctorate at the Institute for Sports Performance of the University of Bern on the topic of NIRS and task failure prediction. Andri, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, Sean.
No, it's a pleasure. So for those who don't know you, can you give a little bit of your background?
Yeah, so I'm Swiss. I was born in Switzerland, but my parents immigrated to Canada when I was young. So I actually I grew up in Canada. I went through the Canadian school system. I did my bachelor's degree at the University of British Columbia in human kinetics. I then moved to Switzerland because my wife is Swiss. So for love, I moved to Switzerland, or back to Switzerland, which is kind of funny. And then I did my master's here at the University of Bern in sports science. And after my master's, I co-founded a consulting company in Switzerland where we did consulting with NIRS, which we're talking about today. In the reason that I had that, I kind of missed before. So during my master's, actually my bachelor's, I started working with NIRS and got involved with this company, Sportif Designs, which makes the Moxy Monitor, and did co-developing of the device. And so then after my master's, I started the company to do consulting with the device. That company got sold 3 years ago, and then I started my PhD. And the company that bought my company, I still work for them part-time. That's EDIAC in Zurich. It's a biotech company, and they also sell the Moxy Monitor. So I do software development stuff for them. Conceptually.
So maybe let's start with the first question. For those who don't know, what is NIRS? What does it mean and what does it do?
Yeah, that's important. NIRS is near infrared spectroscopy. It's a measurement technique that uses like this infrared light to measure oxygen saturation concentration in tissue. And it's at least the physics behind it, or the application behind it. Most people will know it from pulse oximeters, which are like those little like finger things you put on in the hospital. So either you've done that yourself or you've seen Grey's Anatomy or something. So you see people always have these things with your fingers. Especially with COVID going on right now, it's a big thing. Everyone always gets their SpO2 measured, so their oxygen saturation measured. The physics, the thing, and the idea is similar to that. There's some key differences, but that's what it does. It measures oxygen in tissue and in blood.
Yeah. So maybe let's dive a level deeper. What is the difference between a pulse oximeter and a NIRS device? And then technically, how does it work at the local level? How can something tell us? And it's non-invasive, right? You actually put it on the body. You don't have to break the skin or anything. And so how does such a technology allow us to measure oxygen saturation in real time?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of questions there. It's non-invasive, which again, like this pulse oximeter thing, you're taking your fingers, non-invasive. So any other NIRS device is going to be non-invasive. I mean, you can do measurements of the brain as well. You can there's all different measurements you can do, and they're all just surface measurements. Now, so maybe we'll talk specifically about how the measurement works, maybe a little bit more technically, and then we could talk about the differences between a pulse oximeter and the NIRS devices that we use.
Sounds good.
So how it works is, so you use infrared light in the infrared spectrum, and you send in different wavelengths of light. And these wavelengths of light, they penetrate to the tissue. And so the infrared section penetrates much deeper into tissue than visible light. Light in general can go through biological tissue. And if you've ever been a kid and you put a flashlight on your hand and your hand glows, so you know that this light can kind of go through. And that's described by a physical law. It's called the Beer-Lambert law, which it uses different factors to determine how light propagates through tissue. And so we can use this physical feature, to then assess absorbency of certain tissue structures. And so what happens with biological tissue of humans or of animals is that when you pass this infrared light through, certain tissue features will absorb this light at different wavelengths. Mm-hmm. So you can then decide which wavelengths you want to pass through the tissue, and you can then identify certain tissue structures. In our case, you can identify hemoglobin, which is little molecules that carry oxygen on our red blood cells. You can identify if these molecules have oxygen on them or not, because essentially it like changes their color, so you can see them differently in this infrared light spectrum. And then, which lets us identify oxygenated and unoxygenated blood. It's a pretty cool feature. Now, to do this, there's it's not always as simple. So there's like the modified Beer-Lambert. You're going to make modifications to this. It's a big mathematical thing, which you can talk about later, because there's assumptions that are made and things we need to be aware of. But essentially, that's how it works. You pass the light through, and if this light that passed through sees the blood, and it sees blood with oxygen as one color and blood without oxygen as a different color, so you can count them all together and separate between the two. That's what we're doing. And so a pulse oximeter does this, but what a pulse oximeter specifically does is it identifies when there's pulsation. That's what we call a pulse oximeter, and when there's no pulsation. And when there's a pulsation, we know that this pulsation component is caused by arterial blood, so by the heart pulsing. So it makes your blood vessels expand, and then so you get this pulsating effect. And if we say, well, what's relevant for a pulse oximeter is how much arterial blood saturation you have. Mm-hmm. And so you just eliminate everything else and just take the pulsating part and say, well, this is what we want to know. And that's where you get your pulse oximeter value from. And we say, well, this is arterial oxygen concentration. It's the pulsating blood, which is very important to know in a hospital, because you want to know, is the person getting oxygen? Because the arterial blood should have oxygen on it, otherwise you're in big trouble. So when this value sinks, you're in big trouble. The problem with this value in any kind of application is that it's super steady. It should always be close to 100%. If it's dropping, we're in trouble. That's why we measure it in hospitals. So it doesn't vary very much. It doesn't tell us that much in real life. I mean, it's just a stable value. It's like having a heart rate that's always 100. It's not going to do anything for us. As soon as you get values below like 95%, so not a very much variation, a couple percent below, it's already considered, you have a name for it. It's called exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. So if during exercise it drops down, you get this big fancy name, which shows how little it should vary.
Right.
So and what the device that I use, the Moxy Monitor, which is a muscle oxygen measurement device, is you put it on a muscle and it doesn't measure the pulsating blood. You don't want to measure that. That's the arterial blood. We know what that is. You have a pulse oximeter on your finger. You don't need to know that. You want to measure everything else. Right? You want to measure the capillaries, actually. Right. And so the technique it uses is the same, this infrared light. The physics is the same. But what's interesting, because all of a sudden you're measuring in this muscle, which is the tissue is much more complex than the finger, is that you have all these big blood vessels. So you have arteries and you have veins and you have capillaries. And arteries and veins, these big blood vessels with very high density of these absorbing properties of these hemoglobin properties, is they essentially look black to the sensor. Right. Everything's getting absorbed. Mm-hmm. So you don't get that much signal return from these big blood vessels. So the signal return you actually get are from smaller blood vessels, which are your capillaries, which are in the muscle. Mm-hmm. That's why it let's say isolates into this tissue that isn't the big blood vessels. Mm-hmm. And it's also interesting because even like arteries don't really diffuse oxygen. It all happens in the capillaries, where we want the information.
Yeah, so I guess it's convenient for us to have that measure right at where the quote unquote the exchange happens, so that we can see the equilibrium between how much is being brought in, how much is being used, which then allows us to kind of work from there.
Yes, so exactly. That's definitely, it makes it useful, and it makes it much more dynamic than this pulse oximeter. You get these huge, this also freaks people out because, you know, they'll have like 40% and they'll think, oh, I should be 100, right? But the dynamic range is much, much higher in this muscle NIRS measurement than in a pulse oximeter.
So what might be that range that we might see? Let's say, I mean, it's not popular, but convenient and useful in certain testing settings to have it on the quad. Usually on the vastus lateralis is usually where it's placed. So what range can we see, and when would we see it, given depending on what kind of exercise modality or type of training we're doing?
Yeah. So the answer that I would give you is a device specific answer. Would be for the Moxy Monitor.
Right.
This is where we get into a little of the assumptions that I talked about before with NIRS. And there's different ways that you can pass infrared light through your tissue. And the most common way is called continuous wave. You like continuously throw this light out. And then there's like time domain and frequency domain. There's different ways that you can do these measurements and so most devices, or the most common way, is this continuous wave. And the problem with continuous wave is it's really hard to figure out all the different components of your mathematical equation. There's lots of unknowns, and you make assumptions. For this reason, generally accepted is you can't actually get any quantitative values. So all the values get a relative. It's just like they change. So you can say it's going up and it's going down, but you can't really say how much. You can't calculate like you have 10 molecules of oxygen. You don't know. You just have a certain amount, and that amount's going down or it's going up. That makes things difficult. And so one way to deal with this, and so then all these papers have these arbitrary values for like a deoxyhemoglobin or oxyhemoglobin. You just have these values, but the number doesn't mean anything. It can be whatever. But one way to deal with this is to use a percentage. And this is what SMO2 is, which is what I talk about, muscle oxygen saturation. But there's other words for it, like tissue saturation index or tissue oxygenation index, and they're all these percents. And what you essentially do is you take your relative value of oxyhemoglobin and you divide it by your total, so your oxy plus your deoxy, and you get a percent. Percent in itself is a relative value. So, but you get a number now, right? And you feel like this is kind of robust. And I do think that makes a lot of sense, because you end up using change in both your total hemoglobin value and your like oxy or deoxy in relation to one another. So I think this makes a lot of sense. So when we talk about what are normal values, generally I talk about what are normal values for this percent, not for your oxy or your deoxy.
Yeah.
I hope everyone's following this and trying to make it as easy as possible. Now the problem with this now is that there's like this idea. So if you have 0 to 100% scale, does this 0 to 100% reflect reality? Meaning 100% is you should have this completely oxygenated, and 0% mean you have no oxygen. And this is hard to gauge, because there's no real way to like take blood from your capillaries, take it out and measure the actual percent, compare it to your NIRS device. It doesn't work. So the closest you can do is you could take venous blood. You can draw venous blood out and you can check the percent. The problem with venous blood is that venous blood is always a pooled blood that comes together from multiple sources. So if you're measuring like a single site, muscle site, you don't know. At best, you can say your venous value shouldn't be higher, shouldn't be lower than this value, because this must be combining in with these other ones. Okay. But you don't know what it should be. So a venous value gives you more like a ceiling of where your NIRS value could be. Does that make sense? Do you see what I mean?
It does, but like you said, it's all of a sudden with the venous blood, you're throwing in a lot of different parameters from a lot of different places, which kind of fogs things up, and we can't clearly see what's going on.
Exactly. It makes it a little foggy. So what does this 0 to 100% then mean? So firstly, you need to make sure you always use the same NIRS device, and then you can kind of gauge. With the Moxy, maybe to get your answer, with the Moxy, a normal resting value can range from 40 to 80%, which is a lot. The reason for this likely is that at rest, the whole system is riding at a very low capacity, at a very low rate. It's all kind of on shutdown mode, which means your blood supply and your oxygen demand are very low, which also mean that very small changes in either of the two factors, your oxygen supply or your oxygen demand, is going to create very large changes in your value. And so these values all of a sudden can get a little turbulent. They become much more stable actually at high intensity exercise, where you maximize supply and maximize demand. And now you've stabilized the system. What's more interesting, I think, or maybe the relevant point to NIRS and about the 0 to 100% scale is, do you have some kind of norm between individuals when you do certain calibration tests? This is maybe something we could talk about. We could talk about calibration tests. I don't know if you want. Do you want to go there?
Sure, let's go there.
Okay. So this is, in my opinion, the way that you assess if your NIRS device works. Because there's no gold standard. So you want to figure out, does my NIRS device work? And this is, it's called the arterial occlusion method.
Yeah.
And you take your arm or your leg. Arm is usually a little easier. You can do your leg too, and you tie it off, full tourniquet, no blood flow, and you put your NIRS device on. And what you should get is your deoxy value should go up linearly, and your oxy value should go down linearly. Your percent value should go down linearly, and you should then hit a plateau that flattens out at the end.
Right.
Don't do this for longer than 6 minutes. It's not a good idea to keep your arm tied off too long, but 6 minutes is the general protocol. So, okay. And then it should go down. Exactly. And this plateau would be like you've maximally changed the signal. This is where you're going to.
Yeah.
And so classically, you could then use this to calibrate your NIRS system. You could say your relative value plateau at the bottom is 0%. And when you open it up, it's going to go way, way up again, the signal. And then you take the top, that's your 100%. And boom, now you've got a scale 0 to 100%. Right. This is not super sexy to do with people, because tying off your arm with everyone is annoying. But at least the way that the Moxy works, the way the modeling of the Moxy works, is that works pretty well with everyone a priori without having to calibrate. Okay. So if you take a normal person, and you tie off their arm, everyone is going to get close to 0%, and everyone's going to get up to about 80%, not 100. Assuming 100% is arterial saturation, it makes sense that in the capillaries, you're always going to have some loss. It's not going to be fully loaded.
Because
so you kind of that range.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the exchange happens at the level of the capillaries, both in and out of the muscle. Is that correct? So you're always going to have some amount of deoxy coming through. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, you can assume that coming from the arteries, you have 100% saturated.
Right.
It might be 98%, might be 90%, but you have 100% coming in, and the arteries don't really diffuse any oxygen out.
Yeah.
So the diffusion doesn't happen until it hits smaller vessels. That's where you get this diffusion happening, and that's where we start measuring with the NIRS device, and that's where we start seeing changes. And the assumption is that most of this change is all happening in the capillaries. Yeah. So if you have 100% coming in, and now you have 40%, if you measure 100% with your pulse oximeter and you measure 40% with your muscle NIRS device, you would assume that somewhere that 60% is being consumed by the muscle that you're measuring.
Well, maybe to backtrack just a little bit, how did you first come across that technology, and why did it catch your attention?
Yeah, that's good. So the whole reason, maybe I'm going to backtrack even further than that, is the whole reason that I do sports science is because of my dad. So my dad does sports science, and he did a lot of work with a lot of practical with athletes and a lot with like lactate measurements, blood lactate measurements. I actually started doing blood lactate testing when I was like 15 on people. My dad was like, didn't want to do it anymore. So he was just like, yeah, I need data. You can go. So I'm like poking people when I was like 15, which is quite fun. Yeah, so I started doing blood lactate measurements pretty early and was like, wow, I'm going to do sports science. And my dad was, at least as early as I can remember, was very critical of the blood lactate things, of like 2 and 4 millimole and this aerobic anaerobic shifts, but still did the blood lactate measurements. He had his own testing protocol that he did that he felt he could get value out of. But always felt there's got to be different, better tools out there at some point. And so he was always like searching for new tools. And one of the big ideas that he had that's discussed a lot in sports science is that performance is limited by different factors in different people. So there's different varying factors that can limit performance. That's not the same in everyone. And he's like, we got to find out. That's how you do training programming. You got to find out what factors limiting you. Then you got to go train that. And not just, this is your heart rate zone, go train in that zone. Like you got to key in more. That was his idea. And so he started collecting these tools. This was, when was this? Like, I don't know, early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, something like that. And he started collecting all these different tools to try to somehow hone in on this. He then called it like the limiting factor of your performance. And one of the tools that he then came across is a NIRS device by a Dutch company called utilisation. And he bought one of those devices and it was measuring them. It's just a nice research device too. It's quite, it's nice to use. I have one of those as well. And he was like, yeah, this thing's pretty cool. And the more measurements he did, first of all, he started realizing there's lots of relationship between lactate changes and these NIRS value, and between ventilatory values and NIRS values. And he was always like, wow, this thing's awesome. And it was already then a portable device, not waterproof. We always had to wrap it in plastic to make sure it doesn't get destroyed by sweat. And it was, it's like 10,000 euros or something. And he's like, yeah, but if you made this thing a little more portable and you made it like go to a watch, this thing would be awesome. Way better than heart rate. This is what we want. And so he was big on that. And then he actually got in contact with Roger Schmitz, who's the engineer who made the Moxy, because he kept searching for these devices. And then he doesn't always like traveling, so he sent me down to Vancouver. We live in northern Canada. He sent me to Vancouver to meet with Roger, and I met Roger there for the first time, and he showed me this prototype of this Moxy that he has. You should have Roger on your podcast sometime. He's an interesting guy in himself, like how he got to making the Moxy, but that's another story. And so I met Roger, and was instantly like, yeah, this is what we want. This little portable device. It was still a prototype, and that's when we started developing the Moxy with him to make a kind of a consumer product, because we felt this was really a key to making this idea of finding performance limitations possible for the common user. That was at least the goal then. I think that kind of helped. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where do you see that, that evolution of the technology? Where are we now compared to where maybe your dad wanted to see it initially, and where you would like to see it? How far along are we along that development path?
Yeah, it's definitely come some way for sure. I mean, so the Portamon that we had originally, that was already like a big thing, right? I mean, it's a little bit bigger device, but it still was portable. It was wireless, right? And the Moxy just takes that a little bit further. It's a little bit smaller. It was waterproof. It uses Ant Plus. The new ones also use Bluetooth, so you can get it like on your Garmin watch. This data. I think there's definitely been progress there. I mean, a lot of NIRS devices are still lab devices with cables and like big, huge machines and stuff. So there's been progress since 1977, I think, is when Jobsis did his first research with using NIRS to do measurements. So definitely and I feel the pace has increased has increased in the last, say, 20 years or 10 years.
Yeah.
And there's been numerous attempts by companies to make consumer devices. So there was the BSX Insight, there was the Human Hex, there was a German company, Oxy4, that never even that started but didn't actually launch. But they started through prototyping phase. And then of course the Moxy was the first one of those to make this consumer device. But there's still lots of hurdles. Like, you know, I think it's really cool tech. I think it's a big next step. I'm pretty biased, but I think that. But as we see, like BSX went bankrupt, Human Hex went bankrupt, Oxy4 didn't even start. So I mean, the market isn't quite there. And so it's always a question of, is it because there's never going to be one, or people just don't realize it yet? And I just always compare to power meters. Like, everyone has a power meter now on their bike, but I mean, that's not so long ago, and it took a long time. Like, power meters were running for a good 20 years before it like hit that curve where all of a sudden everyone's like, I'm buying a power meter. So let's maybe in 5-10 years we'll see.
What do you think maybe one of the hurdles might be? And I guess I'm talking about this because I'm currently kind of preparing a presentation on kind of the updated model of bioenergetics, as you know, like the old one with the PCR and the glycolytic pathway, and then the aerobic pathway that sequence the graph, yeah. Right? The graph with the 3 colors. Do you think that might be one of the limiting factors? Because I mean, we still hear everywhere that certain time domains are anaerobic, and I mean that goes out the window the second you put on a Moxy and you actually look at the data and what's going on. Do you feel like maybe that model that still prevails in many textbooks and in the general consensus of the training world, might that be a hurdle? Or
I mean, I think maybe it's something. So I think because of that model, the interest in Moxy from the start was always like endurance athletes who felt like they're working in an aerobic, right? I'm measuring oxygen, so it's good for like an aerobic domain. And you really need to then work on why an ice hockey player should use a Moxy, right? You're like, this is all anaerobic. It's all anaerobic alactic and all that kind of stuff. So there's maybe that is potentially. I don't think it's as big as we think. That is exactly the problem.
Right.
I do think classical testing methods that I think that need update or are outdated or need an update. Those are hurdles. So if you go to someone and you're like, hey, you should use NIRS to do some kind of diagnostics, and they're like, we use lactate, this is the gold standard. That's a hurdle. But it's less so. So when I started really kind of like, say, selling the Moxy, which was 8 years ago or something, was that 2013, so 7 or 8 years ago, when the Moxy launched in 2013, I think 2012, 2013. And like 9 out of 10 people wouldn't even listen to me. They'd be like, get out of here. And now it's like 5 out of 10. So it's moving in my direction.
Right. So maybe we can talk about those testing protocols. And from the popular ones, you talked about lactate being still a gold standard. Can you maybe talk about them, how they're set up, and then maybe pick them apart and give your point of view as to why they might not be as precise or as useful as maybe a test with the Moxy or NIRS device might be?
Do you do lactate testing?
I don't. Personally, I don't.
Or any VO2 testing or anything like that?
No, I don't have that access to that equipment at this point.
Okay. So I actually think so. It's funny because the lactate testing is, at least from my experience, much less of a thing in North America than it is in Europe. And I think that has to do with a lot of those lactate ideas from like, maybe there's like very German centric. And so it's a strong cultural phenomenon as well.
Right.
And the ergospirometry, the VO2 stuff is actually much bigger in the US. Now, so to put this in front is, I think both lactate measuring and ventilation data, gas exchange data, both have legitimate value. So I never tell people lactate's useless. And I also tell everyone the most important thing is you need to be able to, if you're getting improvement out of your athlete, you're doing it right. So the problem is that you don't know why, because it's hard to reproduce. Okay. Right. But generally speaking, if your athlete's getting better and you're doing diagnostics and you make decisions based on the diagnostics and your athlete keeps getting better, then rock and roll. To do that, I never try to change people's, if things work, then do it. Just be aware that if things are working and you have no idea why, you're probably in trouble for the next athlete. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I tell people. And then often as well, the next athlete, it doesn't work, it's because they're not talented or something. It's not the coach, it's not my testing. Right. This guy sucks, right? So, but okay, that's a little side note. But so maybe we'll talk about lactate testing first, because I mentioned that. So in the data, I've done this myself a lot, and there's a lot of literature about that. There's dozens of studies that compare the classical lactate curves to NIRS data. Mm. And generally speaking, there's good agreement, correlations between them. So you see an increase or change in the slope of deoxyhemoglobin or of your muscle oxygenation saturation values at the time where you have changes in lactate. So those kind of correlate. So you could, I know numerous people that have bought the Moxy in this case to replace lactate testing.
Okay.
Right. They're like, lactate testing is what I actually want, but this makes it easier. I just want my thresholds.
Right.
And you can do that. I mean, it is easier to do. Now, the issue with I mean, this is the issue with any test. It's not just lactate testing. It's everything. Is like, so this is where you get my testing rant. So I do diagnostics. This is a critique on just as much as on what I do as on what everyone else does, is that you have this classical idea of people come in and they do a test. So they come in to do a lactate test, or they come in and do a Moxy test. It doesn't matter. And you can somehow assess their situation, and you give them training recommendations. 6 months later, they come in and do it again. And then 6 months long, they just run with this data. I mean, that's inherently stupid. Mm. Like, how do you know how do you know that day represented that athlete? First, often then they do perfect prep, like a week, like for a race. They do the test, and then often your values are like, you go by power. So you do power zones. You have a super day, awesome power zones, and then it's way too high for every other training that you're doing. So there's like so many problems with it. And the same with all this. So this is inherently a problem, and then keeping the same results for 6 months is also a problem. So you have all these issues. Now, the reason, at least the way that I see it, why this is the case, is that classically diagnostics was hard. You needed a lab to collect any kind of data. Like blood data was already like, you give blood data, you get it back the next day because it's got to go to the lab, right? And at some point you get this point of care data, you're still taking blood, or you need the big VO2 in the mask and the setup, and everything needs to be controlled, and it's scientific and it's awesome. But it's difficult to constantly do. Now, with technology, the cool thing is the testing becomes easier, and it becomes portable, and it's easier. Because it's easier, you can repeat. So for me, maybe the biggest thing is, I think the biggest critique on lactate testing or any kind of testing is this idea of doing testing days like twice a year, even if it's 4 times a year. And so the whole rant that I do is that you need to do more like a data tracking over time. And for that, you need technologies that allow you to data track over time.
Right.
Now, this already makes big ergospirometry devices useless unless your athlete wants to train in the lab every day. So you're not tracking that data. Maybe you can say, well, I'm going to track it once a week. So you've got to come into the lab once a week. Okay. Lactate point of care is a little bit more doable. You could constantly take lactate data. I was at Red Bull in Austria 5 years ago, trying to get them to buy Moxys, and they did that with their athletes. So they had who's that guy? He's like this legendary lactate coach guy from Eastern Germany, something with a P. He did like the Australian skiers for a while.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. I don't remember his name. But they would take blood lactate measurements all the time.
Right.
You could do that, but I mean, it's not fun. So the point is you, with technology development, you want to find something that you can constantly measure over time. You track the change over time. And then you're not actually doing testing in the same sense. You gather data constantly and you make constant adjustments as needed. That's the goal. And so with NIRS, it seems more plausible that you can do that, because it's like you hook it up to your Garmin and you have all your data in IQ Connect, just like you do with your heart rate data. But so this is I just threw a huge curveball in there, but that's my rant about how dumb testing is. Even though people do testing with me, but
it's got to be said. It's important.
It's got to be said, right? So, so to the lactate point, NIRS and lactate correlate. Also, what correlates is things like maximal lactate steady state and like maximum steady state of your NIRS data, that your NIRS signal stays constant.
Right.
That also correlates. There's at least 2 studies that I know that show that. I've done that myself as well. So there's a lot of lactate correlation and oxygen and NIRS data correlation. And I think this, and physiologically, this makes sense. And this is maybe the inherent discussion to be had is, what does lactate even tell us?
Right.
And so classically, people would usually, well, what's lactate tell you? Well, if you have high lactate values, you're anaerobic. And if low lactate values, you're aerobic. This is at least the very undifferentiated view. And this is where you run into the problem that you're talking about with the energy pathways.
Yeah.
First of all, when you go really, really intense, like a 100-meter sprint at the beginning, that would classically be called an anaerobic exercise, but you're not building any lactate. So people, well, that's anaerobic alactic.
Right.
Okay, sure. Let's just call it that. But you go a little bit longer, you start producing lactate. Well, now it's anaerobic lactic, right? So you start playing with these terms when really it's a measurement problem. The problem is you can't measure blood lactate instantaneously. It takes time for it to be put in the blood. You're building lactate at the beginning of that 100-meter sprint. It's not alactic. It's always lactic.
Right.
There's always lactate being built. And you just measure an overflow of lactate production that then moves into the blood. And that takes time.
Right.
So this lactic alactic thing is already nonsense. And the other part, aerobic anaerobic, assumes that when lactate is being built, that you're anaerobic. Now the question is, well, what do you mean by anaerobic? And anaerobic as a word would have an inherent meaning. So somehow it would have to mean in the absence of oxygen, or somehow oxygen is no longer being used. But there's lots of really good data that shows oxygen is always available in the muscle and is always being used. And what you then see, this is where your NIRS data is funny, is that if you do high intensity work, near instantaneously, your NIRS signal drops. If something was anaerobic, meaning, well, it doesn't need oxygen, which is the assumption, why would oxygen come down? And now if you're somewhat of a sophisticated thinker, you would say, well, you just always consume some oxygen regardless. Yeah, but then the rate of decrease should be the same if you tie off your arm. But the rate of decrease increases with exercise, and it increases with different exercise intensities. So more or less. So the more intense, the quicker the rate of decrease is, because you're using oxygen.
Yeah, I've been trying to think of an analogy or I guess an example in real life. And if you think about it, if you do a sprint, assuming you're not like a professional track and field athlete, but anybody goes out and does a 60-meter sprint, you're going to have to breathe after that. Like, you're not doing this, pinching your nose and then you'll be fine afterwards because it's quote unquote anaerobic. You're going to need to get in some oxygen through your breathing and then push it through the blood and then push it back to your muscles, because you have, I don't know if you could call that an oxygen debt that you just created, and you have to kind of fill the tank back up. So I think even, if we kind of forget about the physiological model, the bioenergetics model that everybody knows about, if we just think for 2 minutes, 2 flights of stairs really quickly, that's maybe 6 seconds, and you're going to be breathing. You're going to need oxygen to put back in there. So it's interesting that we still have that idea of anaerobic, even though we know that on a very short effort, you can even take like a 3-rep max squat, you maybe not on 10 seconds, 2-rep max squat under 10 seconds, you're going to need oxygen as well, and now we're talking strength. So that throws another wrench in the mix.
Mm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, this term oxygen debt, I mean, it's, you can use it. It's this post-exercise increased rate of oxygen consumption, which is clearly measurable. I mean, first of all, you wouldn't have that if you didn't need to use oxygen. And why do you have a debt of oxygen if you don't use oxygen? So, but to that point is it's just clearly that, again, there's pretty good data on this, is that your creatine phosphate, which would be like your key bioenergetic reestablisher, like your buffer for ATP,
Right.
that is highly dependent on oxygen availability. And there's pretty good data on this. So the whole thing is that when you start we take your example, your squats, at the point of starting, you have like these full reserves, right? Your ATP is full, your creatine phosphate is full, you've got oxygen in the muscle. There's always oxygen available in the muscle. So you have these reserves. And when you start exercise, well, these reserves get used. And not until these reserves get used is there any kind of feedback to your central system to be like, hey, by the way, we need more. I mean, why would it do that before? You know, the system's not going to, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, that's why we do warm-ups, to try to prep that.
Right.
Because you can't tell your legs, hey, prep, you know, let's start breathing faster because I'm going to need more oxygen for these squats. It doesn't, we do warm-up exactly to try to prep that. Because there's going to be a disbalance as soon as you start your exercise. And that's what we see. And that's what you see with NIRS nicely, is like you see this clear disbalance at the start, at the onset of exercise, almost regardless of the intensity. You can get up and start walking fast and you see a drop in muscle oxygen saturation. It comes up again and stabilizes because the system adjusts and gets going. But you have this immediate disbalance in oxygen supply and demand, which shows nicely, which also shows the relevance of oxygen in every form of exercise.
Right. I definitely want to talk about VO2max, but before we jump into that, maybe just an add-on question to your warm-up comment. Is there a difference in the slope of, let's say, oxygen utilization when you're warmed up or when you're not warmed up for the same given intensity of exercise? As in,
yeah. So I would definitely say that's the case, and in data that I've measured, so if you start an exercise of 200 watts in your bike cold, you have a much stronger slope decrease than if you've been riding 100 watts for 10 minutes before.
Okay.
It should be this way too. I mean, you have 60 heart rate, and with your 100 watts, maybe you have, I don't know, whatever, 110 heart rate, and then with your 200 watts, 150. The disbalance is going to be much larger. So which is it's a good argument for why warm-ups are useful, for sure.
Is one of the reasons maybe the total blood flow that is going through the muscle at that time, as in if you're cold, you have, like you said, the system is kind of not on shutdown but on maintenance mode, and then when you're well warmed up, you have a lot more coming through, and so when at the onset of something more intense, then whatever you'd be using up on the equivalents, how to put that, you would use the equivalent amount of oxygen to produce a certain effort, but your battery, let's say if we use the battery analogy as being your SMO2, your battery is much bigger at that point in time because you have more flow in the system already. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think you're right. At least what you're trying to say. And so the way that I understood it is that for 200 watts, you need to use a given amount of oxygen to produce 200 watts.
Yes.
Now, from day to day, that could change. There's variations in it from day to day, but you'll have like a certain amount that you need for today to produce 200 watts. This is what I need. If you go from cold, it still needs that amount, but the gap is much bigger. And so if you warm up, the gap is much smaller until you're at what you need. Assuming that you can reach that. I mean, if you just go VO2max, you're just never going to reach it, and you're screwed if you start cold or warmed up. It just might happen faster if you're cold than if you're warmed up. But if it's something you can steady state, you will just get to that steady state faster.
Right.
Right. You'll have this drop off will be much slower. And this is again a little bit with the more blood flow, the more vasodilation, the more blood that's moving, the more stable your oxygen consumption is, the more stable your whole NIRS signal becomes. It doesn't vary around as crazy anymore.
Because you have a bigger kind of value to work from. Is that the reason why? Because maybe in the cold state, the sample size is very small, and so +1 or -1 on a total of 3, for example, is huge, but +1 or -1 on a total of 20 is completely different.
Exactly. Small variations make a bigger, everything's kind of smaller, than these variations make a big jump, whereas everything's kind of bigger, it makes it stabilizes the system. Yeah,
that makes sense. So to go back maybe to the VO2 testing, and maybe let's flip the argument around. What data, what information does VO2 testing still bring us on top of what a NIRS device might do?
So the NIRS device work at local levels. So they work at like your muscle, and like beyond that, not just your quad. It'll like, this is your VL, your vastus lateralis, and this is your rectus femoris. Now, there's advantages to that because you can compare like right and left leg, and you compare it's cool, but it is one measurement. And now generally there's agreement across your quadriceps and across like right and left leg normally. But that is the case. Whereas this pulmonary gas exchange value from your VO2 is a very systemic perspective. It's like, what's your whole system doing? Which makes it is more interesting because it's kind of this it's much more homogeneous kind of value you get. And you get a quantified value. You get VO2 60. This is the amount, right? It's calculated out. Whereas NIRS, again, is this kind of percent, which makes it a little bit harder. So those are definitely advantages. And you get a lot of information about your cardiopulmonary system, which you don't get with NIRS.
Right.
So you get this information about how fast you're breathing, how deep you're breathing, what's your tidal volume. You can start talking about like the efficiency of your breathing. You get information about certain metabolic informations, like your respiratory exchange rate. So like how much oxygen versus CO2 production, oxygen consumption, CO2 production. And it tells you something about, am I burning fat or carbs and things like that. So there's definitely interesting things there to use. Now, and I am actually very pro using your VO2 data, your gas exchange data with a NIRS device. And the reason is that I think they complement each other in that the one gives you more information about oxygen supply, whereas the other one gives you more information about oxygen demand, which those two components together are like this kind of VO2 component anyways.
Right.
So I think using them together helps. So and this is one of the ideas that my dad had. He was big, we got to use them together, and then we would somehow differentiate between supply limited people and demand limited. So if you could get very low muscle oxygen values, we would say you need more supply, and we'd look at your VO2 data and see, well, how fast you're breathing. Are you breathing too fast or too shallow or not good enough? Maybe we need to improve your respiration or something like that. Whereas if you have very high muscle oxygen values, you can't get it to go down. It's more like, well, probably there's some local problems. So we need to somehow improve the local issues like that, those muscles specifically. I mean, this correlates quite well on the VO2 point because high VO2 correlates well with low muscle oxygen values.
Okay.
So the higher your VO2, the lower so the higher VO2 max, let's say, so it's important, or VO2 peak, the lower your peak desaturation value.
Right.
And that correlates quite well. And this also makes sense with, let's say, the general consensus. And there's a lot of debate around this, but I think generally people would agree that VO2 max is more likely to be limited by the amount of oxygen you can supply to the muscle rather than the amount of oxygen that's actually then consumed in the muscle.
Right.
And so that makes sense. So basically what happens, the higher your VO2 gets, the more oxygen you can extract, and you get to very low muscle oxygen values, but you can only get to 0%. and then
Right.
you've extracted everything.
Yeah.
The only way to now increase VO2 is to actually pump more blood and oxygen through that you can keep taking on. So that's the VO2 lactate thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting that what you mentioned on the VO2 testing is I did a 515 step test recently with one of my athletes, and he sails, so he's on the Swiss national team, and so a lot of quad when he's hiking on the boat, and so he does a lot of cycling, and so we did the test on a bike, and what we came back with is most likely a respiratory limitation, which kind of opens up that Pandora's box of, okay, now what? Now, is it, well, it's most likely, I assume it's going to be an inability to extract CO2 fast enough due to the increased THB throughout the rest intervals. But then again, where do you take it from there? Do you go get a Respiratory, do some more respiratory testing? Maybe would a VO2 tests combined with that test have given us more information as to what is limiting him through his respiratory system, and then have further steps from there? So would that be the case? Does it give you that extra information that the Moxy by itself does not on the side of the gas exchange?
Yeah, so the on the 515 and identifying limiters, well, we can discuss that here too, but there's a lot of stuff on the Moxy forum. That's all like my dad's work. When we talk about trying to identify if your respiratory is limiting or potentially limiting, I'm always skeptical about everything. I do think their VO2, so respiratory data, is very important because you get more of a feel for like what's actually happening. So generally, if you go to extreme limitation pictures, so you take people to like COPD people, or you take people who have like myocardial infarction, the people who just came out of heart attacks, where we have where we kind of know, okay, these people must be limited somehow in oxygen supply. And there's even confusion there because someone who has a heart attack has change in muscle structures as well. So it gets real dirty. But we like to keep it simple because otherwise I don't know what I'm talking about. We make the assumption that if someone just had a heart attack, their problem is going to be their heart. That's the assumption. I think it's a fair assumption to make, again, with some nuance. And what we see with again, if you have a respiratory or a cardiac, say disability, whatever you want to call it, we see clear changes in NIRS signal from how it is before. And this is why we talk. And then if you see the similar images in healthy people, we say, well, then maybe your cardiac system's limiting this, or your respiratory system's limiting this. Now, the separating between separating between a cardiac and a respiratory just based on NIRS, I think is actually difficult to do. And one of that has to do with that THB is inherently more complicated than SMO2. We could talk about that later too, but it's a more complicated measure in understanding what that even means. Just like it's blood flow. Well, some people are like it's blood flow, which it isn't.
Right.
And then some people like it's blood volume, which I would more agree with. But even that's more complicated. So so you're analyzing this and it becomes a little complicated. But having the VO2 measures, that's definitely respiratory data.
Yeah.
Like, this is breathing frequency, this is depth. Hey, you've got 6-liter lungs and your respiratory rates like through the roof, and you're breathing like half a liter per breath at like 50% of your max capacity, right? This isn't at the end where you're like, so like probably we could optimize something there. So it definitely easier if you have that data as well. So yeah, I think it would help you if you get that data.
Now moving forward, what for you at this point in time, what are some of the major limitations of the technology, of the NIRS technology, in the way that it might, some people might want to use it either now or in the future? What's still kind of blocking the road in your opinion?
Well, I mean, some things are just technological. So if a NIRS device could measure quantitative values, that would make things a lot easier, right? And those are just developmental issues. If we say, well, the technology at the moment will stay as it is, where are the limitations to it? So one of them is adipose tissue thickness. So fat thickness, that's a problem. It's you need to measure through the fat to get to the muscle. And the more fat layer you have, the harder it is to identify the muscle.
Yeah.
For the Moxy specific, you know, you're looking at like 15 millimeters of fat tissue and you start getting screwed, which isn't always that much. So I'm from Canada. It's not quite as bad. The US is a lot worse, but it becomes not very effective in a lot of people.
Right.
Now you can optimize that a bit. Different devices have bigger spacing differences, so it can go a little bit deeper, but fat tissue is a big problem. How to deal with that. So you're much better off if you have an athletic population, because it tends to be less of a problem. It also becomes more of a problem for women, because women tend to have more adipose tissue.
Okay.
But that's just something to be aware of for sure. Limitations are, for example, THB, I think, is a big limitation in that it's more complicated than saying it's blood flow, and it's also more complicated than saying it's blood volume. And the problem is because we're measuring, we assume this like linear change. So arteries, blood flows, and venous blood flows, and we assume that that's going to be what's happening to capillaries. But there's some pretty nice footage from the University of Western Ontario where they mix like video taping techniques with different spectroscopy and lighting techniques, and you can like look at like blood cells moving through capillaries, and they don't move that uniform as we would like. It's not like they're all like do. So we get this blood flow. They're like going all over the place. There's something called the Piraeus effect. So you get like skimming. So if you have a little bit of a bigger vessel and a smaller vessel, it's not like the same amount go through both. All of a sudden you'll have all going through here and like one go through here.
Okay.
So it becomes a little funky, like the biophysics of it. And this is over my head. Like I'm not a biophysics guy, but I try to look at why does THB not always do what I think it should do. So when I predict THB, often in complicated situations, it doesn't do what I expect it to do, which means I don't understand what it's doing. If I can't predict what it's doing, then I don't know what it's doing. Now, in some situations, it does exactly what I expect it to do. So if I do like an occlusion, I tie off my arm, I know what it's going to do. It always does the same thing. But in exercise, which is complex and a lot of individual variability, it doesn't always do what I think it's going to do. And one of the things is people are like, well, it should go up, right? Because you should be increasing blood flow because you get a higher cardiac output. Why doesn't it just go up? And then this is where if you go to the Moxy, there's lots of, my dad and other people have discussed lots of reasons why that might be. And they're all valid reasons. Okay. I'm not but it's just more like, I just don't actually know. Whereas SMO2, it always does what I think it's going to do, like to more or less an extent, depending on the person. But I never have SMO2 go up when I think it should go down. That just never happens. Yeah. Which means the value does, the parameter does something which I expect it to do. So I know what it does. So that's would be one of those limitations we got to be careful of. And then I'm always like overly sensitive in applying the Moxy specifically, because it's the device, like, you know, it's our device, but generally with NIRS, like you want to then assess everything and think you can, like, I'm not convinced that you can do anything with a 1 rep max using the Moxy.
Right.
I mean, maybe you can get a certain slope of decrease for that one, sure. But, you know, a 1 rep max is like a, you know, 1 or 2 second effort. I don't think it's energetically limited. That doesn't mean oxygen's not used. It is, but it's available in the muscle, right? It's not like this oxygen supply component isn't what's stopping your 1 rep max. At least I don't see it, but I've had discussions. Not everyone agrees with me on this. That's so if you're using the Moxy for 1 rep maxes, I'm a little skeptical if it's going to be super useful. And another thing is, like we have people who they assess dehydration or nutrition. Like they'll put the Moxy on. I've had people, you know, they're riding their bike and like, this is where I drank water and this is where I ate my power bar, and you see the differences in these values. And I'm just a little like, it's coincidence. Like I'm not sold that we're actually measuring anything there.
Okay.
So there's definitely, keep it like in its lane. I think it's super useful, but it has a lane that that the device and the tech goes in, and I don't see why we have to jump. I'm all for trying things out, but you get a lot of like guru type people who are like, oh, I'm using it to interpret this. What do you think? And I'm always like, do what you want. So, yeah.
So yeah, maybe to go back on the THB point that you made. So the SMO2, you're confident, you're comfortable with what it does, what it looks like, and what it's supposed to do in the muscle in real time. How far how far do you trust THB to be accurate? In what circumstances, under what, in the framework of what tests do you kind of read it and allow yourself to believe what it says? And then where do you draw the line in terms of, okay, past this point, or in those cases, I don't actually, fully understand what's going on with THB, and so maybe that might be a limiting factor in terms of interpreting that data.
Mm-hmm. So I think THB is an accurate measure for hemoglobin units. Okay. So I don't think that that's wrong when it's measuring in that relative value. The thing is, what's wrong is in the interpretation of what it's saying. Mm-hmm. So measuring like this one spot and having increases or decreases, and then saying, well, this is the result of some kind of overall increase in blood flow or decrease in blood flow. Those are what I have issues with the interpretation. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe you've seen this in your data, but what sometimes happens is if you take your 515, for example, what sometimes happens is that your 515 data in your rest interval, the THB will go down, will drop, or it'll go up. Now, generally speaking, for me, it makes a lot more sense that it would go up. So when you're riding, you've got this muscle contraction and force and stuff, and when you relax the muscle, it kind of opens up again. You get this vasodilation, and there's your heart rate. It's high, so it's going to go up. When it goes down, it's been argued that has to do with that somehow you're pooling blood while you're biking or running, so you're not letting it go out, and as soon as you stop, now it's dropping. But I mean, you see that with athletes at like 80 watts. And I'm just like, there's not that much contraction force happening here. Like, is that really? And I've used this explanation. So I'm outing myself as like talking to people, yeah, this is what this can mean. And I'm not sure if it really does. So, but the point is then people are like, oh, I'll just ignore it. And I'm like, if you're very applied, you're using lots of athletes and you need to go fast and you need data, ignore it. But if you're somewhat interested, and especially if you have an athlete where you're having troubles like getting anywhere, like they're not really improving, and you're like, I don't know why, then you can start pulling out experimental data like THB and start trying to interpret it. So, because I mean, we've had there's a cardiologist, a Czech cardiologist that I know, Yuri Dostal from Prague. And he's had data on people who then had narrowing of iliac arteries, right? So they have a flow problem in the one leg with pro cyclists, and you see that in like these THB measures because it does something with flow. So all of a sudden you start interpreting your SMO2 in relation to your THB, and you're, well, maybe there's something there. And then that athlete ended up getting stenosis and the widening up that artery, and then the right and left leg looked the same, whereas before it was hugely different because of this narrowing. So I think my suggestion is, if you're having trouble really advancing your athlete, then you use your THB to try to add some information. And then you interpret it probably the way that you are interpreting it right now. So increases in THB is most likely an increase in blood volume, which is somehow related to flow, likely in an open system. Mm-hmm. Drastic changes in this value, like not continual, like gradual, but like real hard changes, are probably somehow to do with contractions of the muscle that are like instantaneously changing your blood flow and then altering blood volume. That's how I would interpret this data. And actually where I think it's, sorry, I'm talking a lot here, but where it's most useful, I think, is if you're doing blood flow restriction training and your goal is clearly to put a lot of pressure on blood vessels by pooling blood. So you get this like pressure there, because it's clear that if you tie off your arm, THB will go. If you completely tie it off, THB stays stable. But if you tie it off to the point where you still have arterial inflow, then you see THB creep up nice and nice, it goes up. And so for me, that's very clear. That's a blood flow volume change from this inflow and no outflow. This is what you would want with your BFR. So you can gauge your BFR to be like, not so hard that I'm getting no change, but hard enough that it's going up and up and up, and my SMO2 is going down and down and down.
Maybe in the framework of a natural occlusion, would you trust THB to assess occlusion trends in the muscle? If we talk about a compression reaction, a venous occlusion, an arterial occlusion, I've seen on the Moxy blog, there's a good article on that kind of strength test with the Moxy, where you do, I believe it was 5 reps, increasing 5 or 10%, going up, and as you go up, you see those changes in the THB trend, which might indicate changes in the occlusion trends. Would you follow that in that context, or do you think it might still be a little far-fetched?
No, I actually think that's one of the more robust ways of THB, because that's reproducible. That's what I would say I can predict.
Right.
You know, if you take good athletes and you increase the resistance load, you will see that that change as predicted that you'll get with more and more kind of this increasing THB value because of kind of it's a BFR, basically blood flow restriction. Just you're creating it through your muscle tension and not tying your arm off, but it's the same thing. That I think is fairly robust. And out of those interpretations come a lot of these other interpretations, right? You say, well, that's what's happening there, so it must be happening over here. But those are, it might be, but it becomes a little bit more complicated, because sometimes you get weird pictures that you can't explain, and you don't just get to ignore those. That's kind of the, you know, if you predict something goes the other way, it's you can't really just decide to reinterpret it, or you know, you need to have some kind of reasoning as to what you're doing.
Instead of just throwing that one out the window and deciding to keep the other ones that made a lot of sense.
This one sucks, let's toss it out. I mean, that's what you do that a lot, right? I mean, lots of data gets cleaned up to make it fit your model, so we don't want to do that.
Yeah, talking about model, can we move on to and talk about what you're doing in the framework of your PhD work, which is trying to model performance using SMO2 data. So can you talk about the concept at large, and then where you are now with your work?
Yeah. So the one thing, I mean, you probably noticed this, is that when you do, let's say, work above threshold, so higher intensity work, SMO2 decreases. And at some point in time, you get failure. So you can't do your squats anymore. You can't do your cycling anymore. And you notice that quite quickly if you use NIRS. There's like some kind of relationship between decrease in your muscle oxygen and the ability to maintain work. And so that's basically the idea, is that is NIRS as a single measure on a single muscle, because sometimes these are complex exercises, suited enough to be able to predict, based on how it's changing, based on kind of a rate of change model, when you can no longer continue your exercise. That's the overall idea. And the usefulness of this is, I always use do you scuba dive? Have you gone scuba diving ever?
I have
before?
not.
Okay. Well, so your viewers have all gone scuba diving, so I'm going to bring this analogy anyway.
Let's assume that for all of them.
Let's assume that, yeah. No, but when you go scuba diving, you have you can only spend so much time underwater, and it's based also on like the depth of where you're at.
Right.
And so when scuba diving, you can get this like watch, and then it calculates as you change depth. It gives you like how much time you have left before you got to go back up. And this is kind of the analogy, is that we would use NIRS during your event to continuously update based on the intensity you're going, which would show in the NIRS, to like, hey, how much time do you have left? And I use a battery analogy often. It's like it shows a battery. And so anytime you go over your threshold, you're going to start depleting the battery. If you go under threshold, you're going to start recharging the battery. And this will be this live continuous ticker. And if you know, I have a 10K running race, and you know, you kind of know my goal is 40 minutes. That's what I think I can run. So you're running, and you see my battery's telling me I got, you know, tons of battery left. I've got for 30 minutes battery. Well, you better start running faster if you want to optimize your energy reserves to get the best time. Mm-hmm. That's kind of this kind of pace. It becomes a pacemaker for you.
And so how far have you come in that work in terms of, I saw your couple presentations that you put together a little while back on your YouTube channel. So you were talking about black box versus white box modeling and that gray box model that you're trying to put together. So how far have you come with that?
So it's still a work in progress. So some things work fairly well. So first of all, the higher the intensity of the exercise, the better the prediction works.
Right.
So we actually did this with elite climbers too, that do like hangboards, that they would hang on these holds. But with cycling, or just like knee extensions as well. So, and this has to do with essentially, if you tie off your leg, so you have like no blood supply, then it works really well. So you can predict it like perfectly.
Right.
And this is probably why at high intensity exercises where you have a lot of muscle pressure, it again works better. So when these climbers were hanging with like all this additional weight, it would work perfectly, because you probably again have almost no blood supply. You get this, right? Then it works fine. But as soon as the system opens up and you get blood supply, that confuses the model. So how to deal with not just the output, the use of oxygen, but the supply of oxygen. So you have to put in all these, this is why we do this black box, gray box, white box modeling, to try to figure out how do we deal with changes in supply. And so we've done a bunch of experiments where we play around with supplying, with like tying a leg off, not tying the leg off, different intensities, while tied off and not while tied off, to try to put this data, so input output data in, to get these algorithms, these learning algorithms to spit out parameters, and we keep redoing it. And we have some preliminary models which seem to work so much better, but they don't always work. And so especially they seem to work now quite well on like isolated muscle exercises, but not so well anymore when we do like cycling, for example. And cycling works better than running, which is interesting, because also like if we go back to the VO2, and I said VO2 correlates well with minimum oxygen peak, so VO2 peak and desaturation peak, that also correlates better for cycling than for running. And that probably has to do with the muscle that you pick to measure. And so if we pick the quad, it's going to be super good for cycling, but for running, not quite as good. Which is, because I mean, cycling is just quad work. It's just like a piston, it's just quad work. And we're running quad is important, but first of all, it becomes more important at higher intensities but it's more of like a catching. So you get a lot of pushing from the calf, and then this hip extension, and then the quad's like catching on every stride. That's where there's issues that we're still working on, and I'm not sure if this will ever actually work. You could see that it never works, and the question is like, I mean, because it's just one measure, it's obviously more complicated than this. The question is it useful enough? That's what I'm really trying to figure out. But I finished my PhD in 1 year, and I don't think I'll be there yet, sadly.
Okay.
But I would like to get at least something useful out for people to use, like on like a watch or something. And at least you can get feedback if it's useful or not. Because I still like being very applied. I mean, in a year, I think whatever model I got, I'm going to try to put out there and see what people think of it.
But like you said, it's a really interesting concept to essentially have a direct physiological feedback as to how much longer do I have at that given intensity on that exercise. Can I push a bit more? Can I not? That's kind of where you're going with it, right?
Exactly. it goes into things like we've used the similar, basically the similar idea, not worded the same way in things like using NIRS to govern like hit intervals, right? Like you want to, the idea is you empty your battery. So SMO2 has to come down, has to come back up, and there's this empty and reload the battery type thing. Or you want to, they're 5-minute intervals. So the idea is that the battery should be empty at the end of the 5 minutes. So you want it to continuously come down somehow. With again, in an applied setting, it's always hard to figure out because you're not doing some kind of like controlled studies. Is if you would have done the intervals in a different way, would that have been better? But we've at least done interval training based on NIRS where athletes have improved.
Right.
Now, if they would have improved more, if you would have just done some standard, again, that's hard. They probably would have improved there as well. I mean, it's the problem. That's why fitness programs are so you can sell anything to anyone, because if someone, unless you're at very high levels, almost everyone's going to improve by doing something. So
right.
It makes it sometimes hard to deal with like what more or less improvement in uncontrolled situations. And the real world is not a lab.
Yeah, you made me think of something. So, for example, in a 5-1-5, at the onset of the effort in that 5-minute interval, so we see a rapid decrease, and then it almost levels out, but then kind of, especially in the higher intensities, it stops the fast kind of drop, and then it keeps kind of creeping down. Is that fast initial drop due to the lag of the system to catch up with the fact that we're using a lot of O2 instantaneously in the muscles? So the respiratory system, the cardiac system have to kind of quickly react. And in that time, we see a big decrease. And then once they've caught up, now we kind of, now SMO2 is not stable, but it doesn't go down as fast as before, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the bigger components is that lag supply and demand that you see. Part of it is probably also contraction based, that now the muscle's contracting again, so it kind of pushes the system together a bit. So yeah, that's definitely why you see those drops again. And then that little, if you have in those 5 minutes, a kind of a slight decreasing, that would be an indicator of like over threshold. So generally, if you look at NIRS data, you find 2 threshold points. You find it's with incremental exercise, so you get a kind of a stable value at low intensities. It's just kind of your SMO2 will stabilize itself out, and then you will find it'll start decreasing. And this is like threshold 1. This correlates with lactate threshold 1 or ventilatory threshold 1. Then it'll go down, and you'll find a second one where it actually flattens out again. And this would be ventilatory threshold 2, lactate threshold 2, often around there is maximal lactate steady, something like that.
Yeah.
That generally works pretty well. I find it's not always the case. And then generally, in comparison to VO2 or the ventilatory, it's you see the NIRS data is either like on point or a little bit earlier happening. Okay. So it'll happen a little bit earlier. This also makes sense if you think that NIRS is measuring like quicker, like directer to where it's happening, whereas your ventilation data is measured after it all comes back up, right?
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, that's why you see that little decrease.
In your mind today, what are the sports or the disciplines that could benefit the most from using Moxy in their testing protocols and maybe even in their training, because it is such an easy tool to use now that you can actually use it to auto-regulate or to plan some sessions in real time. So where do you see the most benefit in terms of sport or discipline?
I think that there's more benefit. So most of this classical diagnostics, physiology diagnostics, is very endurance based. So like these lactate threshold stuff, it's all come from the endurance side. So I think the big advantages will come in intermittent sports like hockey or soccer or something, where so if anyone ever does, if you repeated shuttle runs or you do a continuous incremental running test, you realize those are not the same thing. Start and stop and change of direction mess everything up. Mm-hmm. So continuous running tests to assess fitness of a soccer player or a football player is suboptimal, I would say. So, and then a lot of people see this. That's why you see more and more often these shuttle tests. There's the 30-15 test from Boucher is used a lot. I think these are great tests to do. The problem with these tests is then you do no physiological measures, maybe heart rate. And then you take like Boucher's table and you say, well, what level did you get to? And you correlate that to the VO2 value, which he got out of a running test anyways, right? So,
right.
But a Moxy you could use a Moxy there. You could measure, minimal oxygen values and recovery rates and things like that, which is cool, right? You could then do some assessments there, which you can't do anything else. So I think those sports would benefit a lot from doing sport-specific testing, but still getting a physiological measure out of it that doesn't need to be in the lab. So I think that's where the benefits, the biggest, because there's nothing else. That's why, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on a 30-15, for example, with the Moxy data, what would you look for in the trends, and then how would you use that to would you be able to use any of that to then program, or would it more be to really retest and see the changes in terms of, maybe we started seeing this trend on level 4 or level 10, and then the next test he did, we only saw that on level 14 or 15. So we must assume that between the two, that there's actually been a progress at that level beyond just the score of the test.
So a couple of things are generally, I would never gauge like better or worse based on what happens with your Moxy data. So better or worse is you have a performance measure. If you're faster, you're better. I don't care what your Moxy data says. Right? It's very clear. There's a goal. We've defined what's better. If faster is better. And so I do think the Moxy data is actually then more important for planning your training, to try to make sure that the next time you are better. And what's important then is that the pre and the post test would be to be like, okay, I think this is the reason why training we need to do based on the results. You do a training and then you see, are we better or not? Yes or no. And you see, did the NIRS data change the way that I thought it would and it's better, or no, it didn't change, I thought it would and it's worse. So you start kind of piecing these things together. Which takes the experience, obviously. But there's a couple things that you would look at. So first of all, how low people can desaturate, I think is an important and very simple measure to look at. Generally, the lower you desaturate, let's say better you are in most cases. And so now I wouldn't necessarily always compare this between people, but I would compare this pre and post. Like you can desaturate further down, so your muscles probably somehow the quality there improved, and hopefully performance is better. The recovery rates are very interesting. So like how quick, if you're doing a 30-15, like how are you jumping back up? Because there is relevance there for repeated performance measures.
And how would you then influence that recovery curve in terms of trying to reload O2 as fast as you can? Because that's kind of the name of the game. If you take soccer, rugby, that a sport that I work with, how fast can you go from a high intensity effort to recovering to then being ready for the next one?
So basically if you decide based on your NIRS value that the problem is that your athlete has crappy recovery. So usually crappy recovery is very much related to good oxygen utilization. Right. So people will have very low values and have very crappy recovery, and it looked like crappy recovery. So basically they're really good at using the oxygen, including in this oxygen debt, right? So you have an oxygen debt.
Mm-hmm.
And so if someone's good at using oxygen, they will continue using oxygen to resupply in the break, which keeps O2 low,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's all, if you have all these low O2 values and slow recovery values, it all has to do with, you're really good at using oxygen, which means you're probably in relation not good at bringing oxygen in.
Okay.
And so now you have to start deciding, well, if my goal of my training plan is to somehow supply more oxygen, how are you going to do that? You need a training that is either somehow going to, we get back to these limiter discussions, would be, my heart needs to be, I need to pump more blood. That would be like an obvious one. I need to make sure I can breathe enough oxygen. That would be the cardiac and the respiratory ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that whole system in between, which is a little bit harder to gauge, right? You have the whole delivery system in between, and it's always like a cutoff. What area is now supply and what area is demand, right? You could argue that at a muscular perspective as well. And so classically, what we would have done with like hockey players often is things like respiratory training. And so I work for a company that makes a respiratory training device. You can buy that. But no, generally speaking, you can do, I've had people that do yoga. There's numerous things you can do respiratory training. The respiratory system can limit performance, and there's Dempsey has a bunch of research on that. And if you're from Switzerland, Boutelier has a bunch of research on that. So you can train your respiratory system specifically. And so that's one thing that we did. Another thing is doing training that would increase cardiac output.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what training does that? That's up to you. You're the trainer. That's not my problem. I told you what the problem is, so you go and do it, right? No, but that is an issue. How do you all of a sudden you're confronted with this information that says not this is your heart rate zone to go do your endurance training. It's like, no, you specifically need to increase cardiac output. And then every trainer's like, and how do I do that? I don't know. Figure it out. Yeah, that's the question. How do you do that? Classically, I tell people we'll go do endurance training at lower heart rate zones.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the classic. Go ahead and do that. There's some good data that shows you actually have higher cardiac output values at higher intensities.
Right.
There's data that shows you want to maximize cardiac output, reduce blood flow back to your heart. So tie off your legs for a little while and then open it up again. And then all the blood flow comes back and your heart goes huge preload and you get this huge cardiac output.
Mm-hmm.
This is all kind of experimental. Like, I don't know what you're going to do with it with your athletes, but this is a very good question. And it is a problem in that you're asking the diagnostics is offering new ideas as to why performance can be limited. Mm. But the empirical data for training isn't there. Right. So you're confronted with these issues. And I don't always have a good answer as to what to do. I think it depends. If your athlete's improving, keep doing whatever you're doing. And if your athlete's not improving, is super frustrated, you tend to have more leeway to be experimental. Mm. Then you can try out shit. And you could, we're going to tie your legs today and you're going to go ride the bike. We're going to open it up and we're for a month and we'll see if you get better. So I don't know if that helps.
It does. I think it's a good answer. And maybe bouncing back on something you mentioned, the respiratory training. Do you feel that that might be one area of sports performance that is still underutilized or under talked about? Because I mean, until I got to know the Moxy and what it entails and that, you can find your limiters through this or potentially find your limiters using this tool. And then all of a sudden, you have a respiratory limitation. Now what? You've got these, I guess, these popular, like the Wim Hof breathing method and, hypoxic breathing protocols and all those things. But I mean, when you start talking about the Respiratory, which is really interesting to me in the sense that you have all those parameters that are not, that you can use in a way for strength training. You have, intensity and you have frequency and you have volume and you have all those things. Do you feel like that's still underutilized? And if so, what's missing to try and, push it forward and make it a little more popular? Maybe that's the right word.
Mm-hmm. I do think it's missing. I think it's another training aspect that you can add. And especially for athletes who are always looking to increase training volume. But as you know, we need to be careful with how much volume we expose our athletes to. I think generally one of the biggest coaching error, in my opinion, is too much volume. Like people sometimes just burn their athletes out. And I think it gives you another avenue to do training, to kind of have a stressor while letting other areas recover. Mm-hmm. So I think it can be quite useful for that. I do think that it's not going to be effective for everyone. So like we do get very much responders and non-responders. So some people that make huge improvements and some that none, which can be frustrating. And I think this has to do, again, would be with the diagnostics. You need to figure out, is your respiratory training going to be effective because your respiratory system is limiting your performance? That would be the argument. If it's not, it's probably not going to be quite as effective as a training tool. So I think there's something to be said there. And it also helps if you're only giving your athletes to do training that is actually going to be effective, rather than just broadbanding all athletes with all training. Because again, they only have so much volume they can do. And so you want to make sure it's useful. I definitely think and I do think one of the reasons that it's not so popular is that, like, I learned this, like my bachelor too, is like respiratory system never limits performance. Like proof of that is maximum voluntary ventilation test. I don't know, so the rationale was, just for your viewers, why I bring that up, is that if you do a maximum ventilatory ventilation test, you just breathe as hard as you can for 15 seconds. Mm-hmm. And then it gives you and you times it by 4 and you figure out how much can you ventilate in 1 minute. Right. You can't actually do it for a minute because you fall over if you do it too long. And then you say, well, this is how many you can ventilate maximally, and you never ever reach that value during your maximum cycling test. You're way lower, so that can't be limiting. I mean, right. That's the same rationale as sending someone on a 100-meter run, timesing it by 4 and being like, that's your 400-meter pace, which is already stupid. And then saying, hey, that pace is way faster than your maximum running speed when you're doing your running test. Obviously, speed's not limiting your performance. Mind-boggling why that ever was a smart idea. But there was a lot there that just said ventilation's never a problem. You're always breathing. That's always being trained. And I think there's good data to support that that's not necessarily the case. They can definitely limit your performance, and there's training potential there.
Have you seen non-responders after diagnostic tests that indicated a potential respiratory limitation or not?
That's a good question. I've seen people that I thought were very clearly, it's like, oh, they definitely have a respiratory problem, that showed very little improvement. So that I have seen that. Now, sometimes it's also an issue that I've had where I started people out on the respiratory training program, they didn't really improve, and you change up the respiratory training program, and all of a sudden they then improve. And sometimes I think there's two different reasons why. You can have some people who have like a coordination problem with their breathing. They just breathe weird. Mm-hmm. And some people really have, like, say, a muscular problem where like the actual capacity is not there. Mm-hmm. And so generally what I do now to kind of eliminate that I'm kind of training them the wrong way, or I do much less training consulting now because I'm doing my PhD, but you would always start people out with like coordination work, and then you would start getting them to do this kind of capacity type training. But I mean, you may slow someone's progress like that too, right? Because it's just if you're not quite sure. And the VO2 data helps with this, because you kind of see like how much they're breathing, how much they have, and how fast they're breathing at higher and lower intensities. So that helps a little bit figuring out that problem.
Something that I've seen you mentioned on your YouTube channel, one of the videos, was the effect or the impact of recovery modalities, passive or active, on subsequent peak power of short intervals. So maybe could you talk a little bit about this? And was that a surprising finding for you, or was that something that you expected, given all the experience you have using the Moxy and the role of oxygen in performance in general?
Yeah. So maybe a personal anecdote to that is, you get like your coaches when you're like in high school, And there was always like, oh, you got to do active recovery. So they'd like make you do sprints and like, don't stop, keep running. And then all you want to do is lie down. You're like, why do I have to keep running? Right. It never made sense to me, but like, oh, you got to do this and get rid of your lactic acid and all that kind of stuff. So there's this ingrained thing that this active recovery is important. But if you look at literature, if you look at literature and you look at performance, it actually does show pretty well that passive works better than active. And Spencer is one of the studies that I repeated in some stuff I did. But if you look at lactate, active is better. So if you assume a lactate reduction is important for subsequent performance and you ignore performance, you just say, am I reducing lactate? Then active is better. But if you actually look at performance, yeah, it's not. And what's relevant? Again, performance. I don't care what my lactate's doing. If my performance is better, that's the right modality. And so we did that at the university. We actually did then, we got people to do these 10-second maximum sprint tests, like repeated sprint tests. And we would do active and passive recovery between. And very clearly that the passive recovery had less performance loss from sprint to sprint than the active recovery. And if you look at the NIRS data, is that the active recovery stopped oxygen saturation recovery, right? At like an individual basis. So, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, even if it's lower intensity, being active costs energy. Like this isn't free. And so if the idea is to restore energy supplies and you're using energy, why would that work? And it's purely, I think the whole active recovery thing has really to do with lactate. It's that you reduce lactate. And why do you reduce lactate? Because lactate is energy. And if you're being active, you're using that energy. So you use the lactate, so it comes down. But I mean, that lactate would also be useful to use in your next bout because it's energy. Yeah, so I think that answers, at least that's what the YouTube video that one was about on the data that we collected there.
Yeah, that makes sense. On a slightly more general, general framework, what maybe if you had to pick 2 or 3 myths that are still prevalent in the sports performance world that you could, annihilate from one day to the next, make disappear, what would you pick?
I don't know. I think my pet peeve is more of a terminology thing, and that's like the aerobic, anaerobic, those words, and lactic, alactic, like that terminology, because I think it creates a false picture. So I use those terms often as well because people understand what I'm saying. So when I say anaerobic, people understand what I mean is high intensity. But I mean, you should just say high intensity. So like it's anaerobic work, it's high intensity work. Okay, so I think those words shouldn't be used, or if they're used, they should be used in like a biochemical sense. Like you can take biochemical pathways where there's no O's, right, and call it anaerobic. Yeah. But the problem is that pathway does not work in isolation. And if you take the O's out of all the other cogs, you're dead. So it's weird to call it anaerobic. I mean, it's a human thing on how far you want to zoom in or out and decide to say this is, this is anaerobic or not. And I think at least the let's say, I don't like to appeal to authority, but so I'm going to do it anyways. A couple years ago, George Brooks was in Macklingen in Switzerland, actually. And people know George Brooks. He's a prof from UCLA Berkeley. He's in Berkeley. I think he's in Berkeley. And he does lots of stuff on lactate shuttle and stuff. And his thing is everything's always aerobic and lactic. It's always aerobic lactic. The other 2 terms are like nonsense terms in any sports physiology course. And I think would be eliminate those 2 terms. So anaerobic and alactic would be like my biggest pet peeve. But I don't think that actually has an effect on any training planning. Like you just don't use those words anymore because again, most trainers, they don't use there's just words to sort things. Yeah. but it just becomes confusing then. If you want to argue for respiratory training for a hockey player and the coach is like, yeah, but we're anaerobic. Like, if they would just use high intensity, it would be so, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. One question more for you, Andrew, today. What tests or research projects beyond the one that you're currently working on for your doctorate paper, what tests or research projects would you like to see be done with NIRS technology in the future?
Pretty good question. I do think one of the most important things, and I always kind of get myself on this because I'm not organized enough to do it, is you need to do like more longitudinal studies to really see to see how, for example, like NIRS based training, like you base all of your interval training on NIRS, how that plays out over like a long period of time. And I don't mean like a study of 10 weeks. I mean like a year, 2 years. Now I have some data kind of like this, but it'll be 12 weeks off season, and then the next year, 12 weeks off season, right? Because there'll be hockey players or something. But really kind of do this like long data tracking. I think that would be really cool to do. I think any studies where you're using NIRS as the reference parameter for your training. I mean, that could also be endurance, right? Using NIRS as your, I'm riding with this percentage today. All those things I think would be really cool, because right now it's still the reference values are always the other parameter, and you relate it back to NIRS, but just be like, no, hey, NIRS is the reference value. I think those things would be really cool to do. Yeah.
Let's cross our fingers for those things to happen rather sooner than later. Andrew, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. Where can people find out more about your work?
So you can go to Moxy Monitor, of course. You can, I have a YouTube channel, as you mentioned. It's NIRS Sports Science. I try to put content up. People ask me questions and I try to answer them. It's very low production value, because I don't like putting a lot of time into it.
It's good. It's good. Just to give you an outside perspective, it's good.
Okay. It's just me and I go on rants. But people ask questions. I have a huge backlog of questions, so I have lots to answer. I haven't put a video up for a little bit now. I got to do some more videos, but you can check that out. And there you'll also have my email, so people can also contact me directly and ask me questions, and I try to get back to people. I think would be the best venues to contact me.
I'll make sure I'll link those in the podcast description for everybody to use. Andrew, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks, Sean. It was awesome.
Take care.